the last one. We've reached the end. REL 2930, excuse me. Week 15, which is the last one. All we have left, sorry, I kind of got the bird's nest action there. All we have left is the final exam. So let's get into what we have here today. We're going to talk about politics, racial issues, Syrian refugees, all sorts of things. As you've probably noticed, the Thanksgiving holiday put me behind. So what that means for you is just be mindful of due dates. I've moved some things back in order to make I don't want to say my lack of planning, because I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but make my delay be your problem. So just mind your due dates. A couple of things I've moved due dates back a day or two just to make sure that everyone has a fair amount of time to do things. I'll probably do something similar with the final exam. So I want to give you enough time so that you're ready for what's coming, because I know this time of the semester can be brutal and you're getting ready for your exams. Speaking of exams, ours is coming next week. It is going to be very similar to the midterm in terms of format. So basically, if you recall how the midterm was structured, the type of questions you had, that's what it's going to look like. I will work hard to get you everything you need in terms of your study guide and the question pool that I'm going to draw from, so be on the lookout for that. Those will all be where they usually are. So if you have any questions, let me know. I'm also planning to be in Gainesville this coming Thursday, which is the 2nd, I think. So if you want to talk to me in person, you have the ability to do that as well. That is basically what's left. I'm starting to get into the grading of your papers and your summaries. Thank you for doing that. As always, if you have any questions or if I can help you in any way, let me know on that. So with that in mind, I want to talk about politics, pluralization, talk about the other. What does Christianity have to say in dealing with people who are very different than you? If it's different in terms of nationality, different in terms of race, different in terms of religious belief. What does Christianity have to say about that, and how does it inform global and American politics? How does that, maybe a better way to pose that question is Christianity, or religion more generally, but Christianity in particular, when it comes to what ails us politically, because everyone is kind of intuitively gets what ails us politically. We can talk about polarization, we can talk about extremism. I mean, you just had this Planned Parenthood shooting just a few days ago, and before that, all these other things. Or on a global scale, you have the Paris terrorist attacks and everything that came from that. What does Christianity have anything to say about all this? I mean, we talked about it earlier. There are some folks who want to spiritualize Christianity to the point where it says, we really don't have anything to say about these political, quote-unquote, earthly problems. There are others who say, no, Christianity does have a lot to say about this, and moreover, Christian responses are the only responses that are valid. Those two seem pretty extreme. So are there any positions between those two that could be helpful? I think there are, and I think we're going to explore them today. I wanted to start, and this is, I gave you these pieces on the Syrian refugee crisis, one by Russell Moore, one by Rich Stearns. They actually ended up taking the place of some things that I wanted to assign from Flannery O'Connor, just because, and I'm sorry about that. I know that Flannery O'Connor was a textbook. You still ought to read the essays, the stories that are there, because they're well worth reading. But what I wanted to do, this is such a hot topic, such a contemporary topic, and Christianity and religion is so intertwined with it. I wanted to switch gears and give you something more current. So I hope that's all right. But I gave you these two pieces on the Syrian refugee crisis. The first one was written by Russell Moore. Russell Moore is a Southern Baptist. He runs their Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is basically the political arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. So he is definitely a thought leader that a lot of Southern Baptists, there are roughly 16 million in the U.S., he is a thought leader that Southern Baptists respond to, and also evangelical Christians more generally. I thought his take was interesting because he represents a more conservative stripe of Christianity. And when it comes to the Syrian refugee crisis, and I'm sure you know this already, there has been a major push in some of those conservative quarters to say We don't need to accept these refugees on American soil. This is not a good idea. They might be masquerading as refugees when they're reality terrorists. They might be coming over to hurt us. Therefore, we must limit or totally exclude the refugees that we accept from Syria. I mean, this has been a major contingent of conservative Christianity. Basically, has a belief that is essentially what they believe about this issue. There are others with different takes, obviously, others that are coming from different perspectives. But I think Russell Moore is a really interesting, and he wrote this one for the Washington Post, and I think it's a really interesting take on this issue and what to do with the Syrian refugees, and that he is drawing from his position as a Christian leader, and you can see how that plays itself out. So I just want to give you some quotes that I thought were really interesting and just kind of go from there. He says, "At issue in this controversy are the competing principles of security and compassion, of the United States as fortress and as a refuge." So right there, he's laying out the two different positions. The one saying, we need to make sure our people are secure. We need to make sure that we're not inviting calamity upon ourselves, so we must turn them away. Where the other position is saying, we must show compassion to these people. They are running from terror. We need to open our doors to them. He is outlining basically the two different positions when it comes to this issue. But then look where he goes from there. He says, we being Christians and the church more generally, should be the ones calling the rest of the world to remember the image of God and inalienable human dignity of persecuted people, whether Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or Yazidi, especially those fleeing from genocidal Islamic terrorists. So this is going to be a recurring theme today, but I want you to notice how he makes a case for compassion, but he makes it based on something that is not just amongst Christians. Because this is another response to this question has been, well, we'll let the Christian refugees in. When it comes to the Muslim refugees, no, we need to keep them away. He says, no, there is a standard that is beyond nationalism that we can appeal to, and it's the fact of the image of God and the inalienable human dignity, in his words, that comes from the image of God. Remember, we talked about this, I believe, Genesis 1:27. Humanity is created in the image of God. What does that mean? Well, there's a lot of differences of opinion as far as exactly what that means, but one thing that is well agreed on is that as a result of human beings being called the image of God, there is a dignity there that is inherent, that's not based on any worldly factors, if you will. It's not based on gender. It's not based on nationality. It's not based on race. It's not based on any of these other things. It goes deeper than that. It's basically who you are as a human being. This is, in a lot of ways, this is the foundation of the whole idea of human rights. What are human rights based on? Well, they got to be based on something that we all have in common. Well, what do we all have in common? We're all human beings created in the image of God. That's a common point that we can draw on, and that's exactly what Russell Moore is saying that Christians ought to draw on when they think through the Syrian refugee issue. So he goes on to say, we cannot love our neighbors at the same time we're standing aside and watching them be slaughtered. The Bible grants the state the power and mandate to use force to protect the innocent. That means both engaging ISIS with a strong military response and doing what is in our power to shield the innocent from terror. Anything less is not a sufficiently Christian response. Now here's where I think his conservatism comes into play, because not all Christians would agree with him here that a Christian response mandates not just protecting the innocents, but also going after the ones who are causing these, going after ISIS in a military fashion. Now there are a lot of people, there's a broad swath of agreement. A lot of people do agree that this is exactly what should be done, but not all Christians do. I mean, there are some that come from more pacifist positions that would argue that no, we protect, but we don't actively instigate violence. He's calling for actively instigating violence. And just war and pacifism is a whole other issue that I wish I had more time to talk about. But again, you're seeing this kind of, what is a Christian response in regards to global politics? What does it mean to have a response that is, in his words, sufficiently Christian? What are the things you have to think through? Well, in this case, you have to think through, like he said, security and compassion, but you also have to think through, is war justified? Now, there are many Christians who say, yes, it is, and there are many Christians who say, no, it's not. And there's a huge tradition of that. But at bottom is this sense of how do you apply Christian teachings, um, whether it's scripture, whether it's historical theology, whatever it is. How do you apply Christian teachings to political problems? Can you apply Christian teachings to political problems? And if so, what does that process look like? The other article I gave you on this one was the Rich Stearns. He's the president of World Vision. I'm wearing my World Vision t-shirt today. He is the president of World Vision, which is a Christian humanitarian aid organization that does a lot of work in countries including Syria. So he has an interesting, unique voice on this. And he said this. He says, in the U.S., a number of leaders have suggested that we should only accept Syrian Christians as refugees and keep Muslim Syrian refugees out of the country. This is the opposite of how Jesus called his followers to act. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you, Jesus said. Syrian refugees, of course, are not our enemies. They do not hate us. But even if we thought they were, Jesus tells us to love them. So again, you're taking, in this case, the direct teachings of Jesus, and you're trying to apply them to a political situation and political ethic. The question that comes when you read someone like Stearns, and many people ask some variant of this question, is it possible to do this, to follow the teachings of Jesus? Is it possible for an individual to do this, but maybe not possible for a state to do that? Can a state be Christian at all? That's a really interesting question for Americans in particular, because we all grew up on the notion of America being a Christian nation. I'm sure you've heard it in multiple places. But there are some who would question whether a nation can even be Christian or Muslim or Buddhist, depending on what nation. Can there be a sufficient political response? Or when we're talking about religious responses to these types of issues, is it smarter to think about in terms of the individual? This is a very old argument, and there's a book written by Reinhold Niebuhr, who is a 20th century theologian, writing in the context of the Cold War and World War II. He wrote a book called Moral Man and Immoral Society. And in that book, he makes the basic case that when it comes to Christian teachings, like, quoting Jesus and saying, do what Jesus does, it is possible for individuals to do it. It is impossible for societies, for nation states, to do it. And the reason is that the nation state cannot come across as vulnerable. It cannot come across as weak in any way. And what you need to do as a nation, in order to be a successful nation state, is to project strength and intimidation, even. And it's impossible to do that and follow the ethic of Jesus. So individuals within a society can have a quote-unquote sufficiently Christian response to the refugee crisis. But when it comes to nation states, that's not possible, because the nation state is inherently bound up in its own self-protection. And that is not something that Jesus allows when it comes to following his teachings. He has no place for us. He willingly goes to the cross. He has no place in his teaching for intentional self-protection. He says, deny yourself, pour yourself out, give up everything you have. That's suicidal for a nation state. That's a recipe for oblivion. So the question becomes then, what does it mean? Can nation states have a Christian response to these types of issues? It's a large question. It's a divided question. But the Syrian refugee crisis is really bringing that out in sharp relief. Certainly not the only thing. I mean, you can look within the contours of our own nation, and you can start thinking about the whole Black Lives Matter and the controversies that have surrounded that. The first trial for the officers that killed Freddie Gray in Baltimore starts today. So you can still see that Black Lives Matter is in the headlines. It's a huge issue. And again, the question becomes, what does it mean to have a sufficiently Christian response to this? Is it the type of thing where a Christian response can mean individual response? What does it mean to have a corporate religious response, Christian response to these issues? And I gave you some things. I gave you an article about the Black Lives Matter in particular, and I'm quoting the author here. As the 2016 election cycle gears up, the long-standing issues of inequality, racial justice, and police brutality take on a new urgency. Just as the civil rights movement fought for legal recognition of African Americans' fundamental human and civil rights, the Black Lives Matter movement looks to political leaders to respond to this injustice. So it's a direct call to politics. And we'll get into the civil rights movement in a moment. But it's interesting that it's a direct call to politics, and he goes on to say politicians are strategically poised to address inequalities in America's social and economic systems. So he's making the argument that, yes, it has to, the solution, these problems exist, and the solution has to be a political solution, has to get at the systems of inequality, the systems of injustice. Now this is, I gave you Russell Moore on Syria is more of a conservative position to that issue. This is more of, call it a progressive or mainline Christian response to the Black Lives Matter issue, because there are many on the more conservative side of the ledger that would read this and go, well, I'm not sure I agree, because you're asking the political system to do something that it was never designed to do. I mean, when you think about racism in general, is there a political solution to racism? The evangelical or the conservative Catholic would look at you and go, no, that's a heart issue. You're not going to be able to, to implement political change, political systems in order to change the heart. I mean, we read John Locke's essay, or bits of it, a little while back. States don't have the power to do that, was the argument that he made. People need the freedom within the nation states to come to these positions, to come to a position of repudiating racism, but the state can't do it for them. But here you have a position that's different, that says, no, politicians are the only ones that can address these issues and make real change on these issues, because they're going about dealing with systemic issues. And he'd get into the whole question of the individual versus the system. Black Lives Matter activists will make the argument, some of them will make the argument that, I accept that not all individuals are racist, but even non-racist individuals operate within a racist systemic system. That would be systemic system, a racist system. That would be the argument that Black Lives Matter, for example, might make. Whereas someone who disagrees with this would say that's ridiculous. Systems are nothing but basically the conglomeration, that's not the right word, the aggregate of individual human hearts. So if you want to make real change, instead of dealing with quote-unquote systemic issues, you need to deal with individual hearts and minds. You need to win hearts and minds, and that is the way to make racism go away. Again, a very similar question to the Syrian refugee crisis. Can political solutions work here? Is there a difference between the state's role and the church's role in solving these issues? When you think about Russell Moore and Rich Stearns, they were talking specifically to churches and individual Christians, whereas this, coming from a different perspective, is making an explicit call for political movement. It's an explicit call to political leaders to make these things happen. Do you see the differences? Do you see how the different approaches are based on different assumptions, if you will? And that leads us to a letter that really everyone should read. Many of you have probably read this already, but if you haven't, you have to, which is one of the reasons I assigned it. And even if you have, you need to read it again, which is the other reason I assigned it. It's a letter from Birmingham jail. It's Martin Luther King Jr. It's one of the most famous documents of the 20th century for sure. One of the famous writings, most famous writings in American history in general. And it's just fantastic. But again, I want to walk through it with you. I want to look at the ways in which religion and politics coincide, overlap, or in some cases butt heads with each other. And I think it'll give us a fuller picture here of what we're looking for. So you have MLK. He's writing to a group of white pastors who accuse him and the civil rights movement more generally of moving too fast and wanting too much too quickly. They're saying, you know what, you're destabilizing the public order. You need to slow down. You need to adopt a form of gradualism, which is the technical term for it. Gradualism that says, move slowly towards your goals, but be patient in the meantime. And MLK is basically to the point where he's saying, you've been telling us that forever. Nothing tangible is coming. We need to disrupt the system a little bit, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I think it's an extremely famous document for a lot of different reasons. But he brings up something, and I want to get into this because I've been talking a lot about the difference between individual response and societal response, corporate response. The individual response is based on the assumption, at least in part, that I can be fully independent in my actions from you. That each person is responsible for their own actions, each person is responsible for their own place in the world, if you will, and to ask one person to be responsible for the actions of another is wrong-headed and unfair and so on and so on. MLK rejects this, and he rejects this early in the letter, right out of the box. In his typical beautiful language, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Now this is interesting because this is going to give us, again, this is going to help us work toward a solution of, what does Christian politics look like? How does it work itself out? MLK rejects the kind of, I'll take care of my business, you take care of yours, and we'll all be at peace with one another. Kind of the libertarian position, if you will. And he says, no, it's all related. What happens to me is related to what happens to you. What you do is related to what I do. So you need to bear the burden of responsibility that comes from that. You need to bear the burden of the responsibility that your actions, either directly or indirectly, have contributed to conditions that civil rights leaders are moving against, are demonstrating against, are gathering against. You can't just wash your hands and say, well, that's awful that they came up against individual racists, but that really doesn't have anything to do with me. I'm not racist. MLK's point was, well, you are a contributor to the society, to the culture that prevails. So as a result, what you do, absolutely, you are on the hook for this. Whether you like it or not, you are on the hook for this. And it's something that you're going to need to address and take responsibility for and act to improve upon and act to change. So again, from this perspective, you have MLK. I think he would look at those who kind of try to separate themselves from the. We talked about separatists a little bit. The people who would try to withdraw into their own communities and leave the world to its own devices. I don't think MLK would have had much patience for that. I think he would have said, no, you're on the hook for this too, so you have a moral obligation or responsibility to work to change it and make it better. And again, circling back to the Syrian refugee crisis and that's precisely the argument that Black Lives Matter is making. That you are, even if you're not doing anything explicitly racist, you are contributing to a culture that they are reacting against. And even the Syrian refugee issue. Some people say, we need to take care of our people. That's awful what's happening in Syria, but that's not anything we've caused. Again, MLK would look at that and go, that's nonsense. And I think he would actually have a good case in this one, because if you look, if you go back into the history of the U.S. involvement in Syria and dealing with Assad and dealing with the Kurds and Turkey and everything else, that becomes a hard case to make. So again, though, you have what you're building to, or what I'm driving towards here, is the idea that something must. You have a responsibility to do something. But what is that? Going on in MLK, you deplore the demonstrations that are presently taking place in Birmingham, but I am sorry that your statement did not express a similar concern for the conditions that brought the demonstrations into being. Again, the systemic, the cultural, the atmosphere. I am sure that each of you would want to go beyond the superficial social analyst who looks merely at effects and does not grapple with underlying causes. I would not hesitate to say that it is unfortunate that so-called demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham at this time, but I would say in more emphatic terms that it is even more unfortunate that the white power structure of this city left the Negro community with no other alternative. So again, the question becomes, can there be good people in a systemic injustice? MLK says no. That if you are good people, you are by necessity, if you're a good Christian, if you want to use that language, you are by necessity taking on the systemic injustice that you see. Whether you are a direct cause or not, MLK says you're a cause. And you need to deal with that reality. So what do? You don't, military action doesn't seem to make a lot of sense in some cases, although, more argues for military action than the Syrian thing. MLK famously, obviously, took the option of peaceful resistance. And this is a very interesting pose to take, because this is, echoes of Christianity abound in this approach, as we will see. So he says, so we had no alternative except that of preparing for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and national community. We were not unmindful of the difficulties involved, so we decided to go through a process of self-purification. We started having workshops on nonviolence, repeatedly asked ourselves the questions, are you able to accept blows without retaliating? And are you able to endure the ordeals of jail? Notice the language. We decided to go through a process of self-purification. That's religious language. That is explicitly a call for religion. That's preparation for a religious act. And in MLK's language here, nonviolent, peaceful resistance is a religious act. It was influenced by Gandhi and MLK's experience. If you ever go to the MLK Center in Atlanta, which you absolutely should, one of the things you're going to see there is a very large statue of Gandhi himself. And the reason for that is that MLK was profoundly influenced by Gandhi's own nonviolent, peaceful resistance in Gandhi's dealing with the British Empire. Now, where did Gandhi get it? Well, one of the places from which he got it was from Jesus himself. The peaceful resistance, you can draw a direct line that goes all the way back to Jesus. Because nonviolent, peaceful resistance runs counterintuitive to so much of global geopolitical logic, right? It's not, I'm going to crush my opponent with force. It's, I am going to accept and absorb the violence of my opponent, and I'm going to awaken their conscience within them in order to change them. Soul force was the term that MLK used. And he basically said, instead of vanquishing my opponent, I'm going to turn his action back on him. I'm going to awaken his shame and his conscience, and I'm going to liberate him from his own addiction to violence. And instead of him becoming an opponent I've beaten, he's going to become my brother and my friend. Powerful model, but obviously not one that everyone can take on. And you see the preparation that had to be involved in order to be able to take that role. It was a process of self-purification. It was a religious preparation. So this is a very religious response that is tied back to Jesus himself. You could even, I have up here a passage from Isaiah 53, verse 10 through 12, which many people draw a line from that passage to Jesus. It's often considered to be one of the most forthright predictions of Jesus in the Old Testament. But if you've never read that, you ought to read the whole passage if you've never read it. But let me just give you the last 3 verses. Yet it was the will of the Lord, talking about the suffering servant, who many people associate with Jesus, to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured himself out to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. So this is Jesus foretold in the Old Testament, at least in the opinions of many. And this was what Gandhi looked at. This was what MLK looked at. And what's important to note is the second half of this passage. Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great. This isn't just this isn't masochism. This isn't just suffering for suffering's sake. This is anticipating victory through suffering. Now, I know redemptive suffering is an issue for a lot of folks. And it's controversial. I mean, you can't get around the controversy of redemptive suffering. Not least of which because a lot of people in positions of power have looked at people that they have marginalized and exploited and said, hey, there's this doctrine of Christianity called redemptive suffering, and you really need to take it on for yourself. Meanwhile, you can find me poolside with a drink in my hand living the good life. So that has happened. And that has made a lot of people very skeptical about this notion of redemptive suffering. But it's also hard to deny the power involved here. And it's hard to deny the fact that this was a direct influencer of Gandhi and MLK. Going back to MLK and how he describes it, he says, nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and establish such creative tension that a community that has consistently refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. So again, this isn't passivity. This is active warfare. But what's the difference? It's rejecting violence as a means of warfare. MLK wants to win, but he wants to win the right way, if that makes sense. And again, I mentioned Gandhi a lot, quoting Gandhi here in a different letter. But some celebrated writers of Europe and some savants of India as well say that humanity can never be free from hate. I contest the view. I even say that until a man frees himself from hate, he cannot become a man, cannot be his real self. Willy-nilly, and sooner or late, we shall have to take that road and that alone. And I have come here to ask you, why not go that way willingly and soon, rather than be forced into it? It may seem strange that I should say this to Christians, but I have pleaded for the same thing to Hindus also. Some Christians, however, tell me that Jesus' message of love was meant only for his 12 disciples. In India also, those who appreciate nonviolence say that it will make India a country of cowards. To them I wish to say, India is doomed if it does not accept nonviolence. So again, this isn't shrinking from power. This isn't cowardice. On the contrary, MLK and Gandhi would argue that it's courage. And in Gandhi's language, it is the way to become who you really are, to become your full self, your real self. And Gandhi quotes Jesus, and Gandhi has this very famous quote where he says, I like their Christ, but I don't like their Christians. He had a very high regard for Jesus, and it's pretty easy to make the case that Jesus' example and Jesus' life influenced Gandhi's approach and his nonviolence, which in turn influenced MLK. But it's important to note this because we're working towards a Christian response. On one continuum is just don't engage, focus on quote unquote spiritual stuff, and don't engage what's happening in the world. The other is the temptation to take up arms. More hints at that, but you see that more explicitly in things like the Crusades, and even some of the American military language. We must take arms in order to do what God would have us do. This is a different approach. This is we must be actively against the evil in the world. We can't just kind of throw up our hands and say it's there and there's nothing we can do about it. But at the same time, we do not meet, to use their language, we don't meet evil with evil. We don't meet violence with violence. We confront it and we defeat it in a different way. So finally, MLK one more time. My friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined legal and nonviolent pressure. History is a long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. So again, this isn't just sitting around and waiting for the tides to change. This is direct action. But the key is it's direct action without violence. And then in the letter in Birmingham jail, MLK switches gears. And he says, he's been dealing with the objections of the white pastors that wrote to him. Hey, you're going too fast. Hey, you're doing these things. And he finally gets their most serious objection. Hey, you're threatening the public order, and moreover, you're breaking the law. That's not something that a Christian minister would do. So MLK feels compelled to address this. And he cites, in the beginning of this, he cites St. Augustine. He says, an unjust law is no law at all. What's he doing here? He's appealing to a higher law. He's appealing to what Aquinas would call the natural law. You notice all the references to Augustine and Aquinas in this letter. Why? Because he actively is learning from them and taking things from them in his own doctrine of nonviolence. He says, look, there are laws which line up with the moral law. There are laws that not line up with what Aquinas would call the natural law. But there are also laws that don't. And laws that are just and laws that deserve to be followed are not just laws made up. I don't just follow the law because some authority figure said you must do this. I follow the law because it aligns with how I view God to be, how I view other human beings to be, how I view the world to be. And this is the natural law. The natural law, in Aquinas' thought, the natural law was basically figuring out how God made the world and living accordingly. What does that mean? Well, that means if God made humans with inherent dignity and a certain equality amongst them, then laws that foster racism and foster prejudice defy how God made the world and defy how God made humanity, and as such, don't deserve to be followed. So he's reaching beyond human law, MLK is. He's reaching beyond human law, and he's appealing to the higher law, if you want to call it that. And this, again, I mentioned it before, but this is the basis for human rights. What gives us the authority to look at something like ISIS, for example, and say, hey, they're beheading people. Hey, they're selling women into sex slavery. Hey, they're doing all these. That's awful. How can they do these things? What gives us as an American the right to be able to even say that? It's like, well, or to put it another, maybe to use a better example, back in Iraq when Saddam Hussein was leading Iraq, part of our rationale for invading Iraq was look what he's doing to his own people. Now, on one level, you make the argument, well, why should we be concerned about that? He's an Iraqi leader; they're Iraqi citizens. He is making the law that they need to agree to. And if laws were only human creations, then there's a certain logic to that. But if he is, which he was, making laws that are in fundamental defiance of the way the world is created and the inherent dignity of the individual, then as an American we have a right to look at what he's doing and get worked up and get upset about it. This is basically human rights in a nutshell. Now, of course, the Christian foundation is not the only foundation for human rights. There have been many others, very well articulated and very well put. But a major plank in the whole idea of human rights is this idea of humans being created with inherent dignity. And the easiest way to make that case is to point to Genesis 1 and say, there it is. So it makes it an argument worth paying attention to for sure. So you have this higher law, but MLK goes on to make the case that in order to, even just, it takes strength and it takes real courage to defy the human law in favor of the natural law. It takes a willingness to suffer. It takes, he's writing this letter from a jail cell. It takes commitment, not to sound too trite, but it takes a lot of commitment. It takes, in his words, extremism. Now, again, in light of the Paris attacks and everything that comes with that, you hear the term religious extremist a lot. You very rarely hear it in a positive. MLK, again, is reminding us that there is more than one type of extremism. That religious commitment is not necessarily inherently evil. Because, again, today, when you hear the term religious extremist, somebody who takes their faith way too seriously and is willing to do really awful things as a result, that's the predominant definition nowadays, and that's an unambiguously negative definition. MLK says, no, that's not the only type of extremism there is. And this is one of my favorite passages from this letter. He says, but as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a bit of satisfaction from being considered an extremist. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the gospel of Jesus Christ? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God. Was not John Bunyan an extremist? I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a mockery of my conscience. Was not Abraham Lincoln an extremist? This nation cannot survive half slave and half free. Was not Thomas Jefferson an extremist? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that not all men are created equal. Be a bad slip of the tongue there. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate, or will we be extremists for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice, or will we be extremists for the cause of justice? And in order to claim the human rights in defiance of human laws, MLK says extremism is the only hope that we have. So it's kind of counterintuitive. I mean, how do you deal with people that say, religion, man, we'd be so much better off without religion. We'd have less wars, we'd have less hatred. People wouldn't be as divided as they are. We really should just get rid of religion. MLK, again, a Protestant minister, coming from an explicit religious tradition, says, no, religious devotion, even the religious extremism, can be put to the service of the good. It's not just put to the service of destruction and terror. So it's interesting to think about. So, hints at the larger question, the question that we've been dealing with, dancing around. What does Christianity contribute to political questions? Is it part of the disease, or is it part of the cure? There are some who would say, religion is the problem. There are others that say, well, maybe not. Religion's not the problem, but maybe it's not the tool to affect solutions. And then you have MLK, who's kind of saying, no, it can be the problem, but it can also be the solution, and it can really contribute in a very, very unique way to these questions of rights, and if it's civil rights or whatever it is. But he does point out in the course of the letter that there are some who, under the guise of religion, are not interested in helping, and they make the argument that that this is not even issues that Christians ought to be getting themselves involved in. A modern variant of this is, why should we care about feeding the hungry when there are souls to save? Now, that's a caricature. Not every Christian believes that. I would say even the majority of Christians don't believe that, but that's an argument that's been around a long time in terms of what is more important to the Christian, to meet physical, material needs or to meet spiritual needs. There's been a lot of differences of opinion on this, and it's a huge fundamental question. But MLK says, no, we need to, there are things that Christianity can affect, can bring to bear right now in the material physical world, and just leaving the afterlife out of the discussion. But on the flip side, he says there are some that are going to be so fundamentally concerned with the afterlife. Again, that C.S. Lewis quote, they're going to be so fundamentally concerned with the afterlife, they're not going to be really engaged in dealing with justice issues. He says, in the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churches stand on the sidelines and merely mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I have heard so many ministers say those are social issues which the gospel has nothing to do with, and I have watched so many churches commit themselves to completely otherworldly religion which made a strange distinction between bodies and souls, the sacred and the secular. Again, so you have this dualism, and MLK says, I'm not interested in that. Points to the larger vision of a church that is active and powerful, again, in this world, in the physical world. And forgive me for reading so much, but just, I'm walking through this, and it's such a famous document. There's so many beautiful passages, you kind of have to. He says, there was a time when the church was very powerful. It was during that period that the early Christians rejoiced when they were deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was the thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Wherever the early Christians entered a town, the power structure got disturbed and immediately sought to convict them for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But they went on with the conviction that they were a colony of heaven and had to obey God rather than men. They were small in number but big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. They brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contests. So again, he's pointing out real-world examples of positive change affected by Christians. And not just any Christians, extremist Christians. Christians who are willing to open themselves up and suffer for what they believed in. These are the ones that are going to be the thermostat, that are going to change the temperature of society rather than being merely the thermometer that reflects it. Because that is the danger of moderate kind of blend in with the culture of Christianity, right? I mean, after a while, it becomes a question of who's driving who. Is your religion driving your politics, or is your politics driving religion? And that's a major question today. Because you have a lot of accusations and a lot of people on both sides looking at the other going, your politics is driving your religion. Your politics is driving your interpretation of what Jesus said. So it's a very real question. But MLK is pointing to instances in which the church and Christianity and a explicitly religious response can do a lot of good. But we read that today and go, okay, but what about when religion goes bad? And this is why I gave you the pieces from Miroslav Volf. Miroslav Volf is a theologian at Yale, Eastern European, survived all of the warfare and the conflict there, and wrote a brilliant book about it. But he has a lot to say about pluralism. And what's pluralism? That's people, extremists, religious extremists, if you will, and also secular extremists, but living together in peace. So you're devoted to your religious faith, you're devoted to your Christianity or whatever faith you hold, but at the same time, it's not a totalitarian ethic. You're not going to have violence in order to get your way, but you're going to have a system where people can live together in peace. He said, and he acknowledges in the beginning of his article, is it time to eradicate religion? Kind of a provocative title. In the beginning of the article, he says, in a globalized world, the terror of God's crazy-eyed followers is threatening lives, peace, and prosperity of everyone on the planet. So it's a very real thing. Religion causes problems. And any internet discussion board or go on Twitter, you're going to find plenty of people who are willing to make that argument. Christianity is part of the disease. All religions are part of the disease. They're not part of the cure. We would be better off without them. And one of the reasons that is often brought up, and Volf references this in his article, is that the inherent division, the inherent polarization, the natural result of dividing people into holy in one category or damned on the other, sheep on the one hand and goats on the other, if you want to use the biblical imagery, that the violence of one group towards the other is just an inherent result of that division. The way Volf puts it, world religions divide humanity into an in-group and an out-group. Insisting without sufficient reason on the truth of your own view of the ultimate reality and the way of life corresponding to it is bound to breed violence, many critics insist. So again, why is religion a problem? It divides and it leads to violence, is a major argument on that score. But he goes and says, no, it's not necessarily religion that's causing the problem. Remember, there are cases where politics or other things drive religion, and they bend religion to do really bad things. The way he puts it, put the glove of religion on the hand of either a revolutionary or a statesman, and religion will be pulled into the dynamics of cohesion, control, acquisition, and maintenance of power, and the marking of boundaries, and will more likely than not turn violent. In other words, align moral self-understanding of society, state, and religion, and even the most peaceful religion will become ready to take up the gun. So, if you let religion get co-opted by something else, whether it's nationalist identity, politics, power, and the desire for power, if you let it get co-opted, it's going to get co-opted in a violent direction. And this is exactly the argument that every one of your social media feeds, you have someone making this argument, either for or against, on your timeline, and it goes something like this. The terrorists who commit atrocities in the name of Islam are not true Muslims. They are merely using Islam for their ends of grasping power. And the other side of that argument is, no, they actually are Muslims, and it's inherent in this religion. It's a quote-unquote violent religion. You have those people on your Facebook timeline. I'm willing to bet the farm that you have both of those people on your social media timeline. Volf is definitely in the category of the first. He's in the first corner. He says, look, at these religions have much in them to contribute to peace, and he'll get into that later. But when they get co-opted for bad ends is when they go bad and turn violent. Now put the glove of religion on the hand of a revolutionary, and you're still going to get violence and demonstrations of power, but you're going to get a religious veneer on top of it. It's going to be done with religious language. But the lust for power and the violence is the same, no matter what. So Wolf says, these religions are not causing the violence, but rather they're getting wrapped up in it. But he also says this, he says, but all world religions have resources not just to avoid underwriting violence, but to promote cultures of peace in pluralistic environments. So they can be part of the cure and not merely part of the disease. And these are the values that he cites. The one we've already talked about, equal moral value of all citizens. You're all created in the image of God. If you're Christian, Muslim, Hindu, whoever, therefore you all have an intrinsic dignity. And I know it's a politically loaded phrase, but the phrase "all lives matter," right? Take away the political loadedness of that, and you have an inclination of what he's driving at. The sense of there is a common dignity that all of us share, no matter what religion, no matter what race, no matter what nationality, and we can build peace on that respect. The second value, freedom of religion. People cannot be forced to adopt religious faith. Remember John Locke's essay on tolerance. And in the video, Wolf explicitly talks about that essay. He says, very few religious traditions will rely on coercion in order to gain members. And of course there's going to be exceptions. Within every religious tradition there's going to be exceptions. But the rule is that these religions put their view of the world out there, and then they let the person they're talking to decide if they're going to accept that view of the world or they're going to reject that view of the world. And to use Christian language, when someone is evangelizing, someone is telling someone else about Christianity, it's their job to tell them about Christianity. It's not their job to convict them to become Christians. Only the Holy Spirit can do that. And that'll be the way you hear that phrase. But it's the same idea. It's like you have the job to present this view of the world, but you don't have the job to bring the other person to this view of the world. That's not something you can do. There's a supernatural power that's responsible for that. So you give the other person the freedom to decide. So that is within Christian and religious tradition. Separation of religion and rule. And here's where the countercultural element comes in. Drawing the distinction between the community called the body of Christ and the political order of the empire, early Christians, for instance, embraced different levels of loyalty. Christ gives substantive direction to Christians' lives, and they give him ultimate allegiance. The political order provides the conditions of their living, and they give it conditional loyalty. All world religions provide resources for motivations to make similar distinctions. So Wolf, what he's saying here is that, when it comes to political response, the primary duty of the Christian, and he says all religions, I'm focusing on Christian because of this class, the primary duty of the Christian is to respond to the higher law first, the national law second. Our primary identity is not American or Mexican or Canadian or French or whatever. Your primary identity, your primary allegiance, your primary loyalty is what St. Augustine calls the city of God. That is, the kingdom of God is your foremost membership, is your foremost who you are. National identity just comes second. And the purpose of a national law is to give you the space in which you can pursue your vision of the city of God, whether it's a Christian vision or not. And then the fourth thing he said, and before I leave that, erasing that distinction, erasing those levels and saying it's all blended together and your Christianity and your Americanism, for example, are hard to tell apart. He says that's a disaster for America, but it's also a disaster for the Christian as well. It's going to co-opt, like we said before, it's going to co-opt that religion and make it something, warp it into something it was not meant to be. So then the fourth value he says that Christianity and other religions have at their disposal, constant reflection and reform. These traditions, and Christianity certainly falls in this category, constantly self-examining and tweaking and making reform based on that examination. um, a capacity to change, to adapt, to change, and to get better. Um, so what Wolff is arguing then is he's arguing that Christianity has within its tradition all of these values. It can bring all of these things to bear, and it can therefore be a powerful force for good in the world. But that's not a shoo-in. That's not guaranteed. It's all too easy to become intoxicated by the lure of political power. And that begs the question: when people say America is a Christian nation, what do they mean? When people say we need to take America back for God, what exactly are they referring to? In a lot of those cases, I would argue that they're getting sucked into this political vision. And Wolff says, no, you have to you have to leave space between your identity as an American on the one hand and your identity as a Christian on the other. And it's a challenge, because all worldviews lean toward totalitarianism, even secularism. There is an instinct in Christians, there's an instinct in Muslims, there's an instinct in atheists to say that this view of the world is right, that view of the world is wrong, and therefore, if you don't adopt this way of the world, then you are lesser. You are excluded, you are marginalized, you are punished. Wolff is fighting against that. He's arguing against that. He's saying that Christians use what is distinctive, use what is countercultural to fight for that which is common to all. And he uses the expression human flourishing. Our common good is another one. Where you fight for the good of everyone, even those that aren't the same as you, based on your commitments, on your religious commitments of a God who has created everyone with dignity, of a God who does not force himself on his followers but leaves an element of choice. That is what you base pluralization on. That is how people who believe very differently from each other can coexist. They take what is distinctive in their own selves and they use it for the purpose of common good and human flourishing. And it's really it's an inspiring vision. It's certainly not an easy vision, but it's an inspiring vision. So it's anyone can rattle off circumstances where Christianity has done good in the world. Anyone can rattle off situations where Christianity has done bad in the world. But is there a comprehensive worldview? Is there a comprehensive structure to build Christian engagement with the world on? I think there is. A lot of Christians will answer that question, probably not. Our best bet is to get in, circle the wagons, get our own little communities, and let the evil world go to its own devices. Others will say, well, yeah, your only way in is to basically just go all in your nationalistic identity. Christianity walks that line and says, we're not going to engage in, we're going to engage in politics, but we're not going to engage in the tools that are often used in politics. We're not going to engage in violence. We're not going to engage in marginalizing the other. We're going to use what we have, but we're going to use it for the benefit of us all in human flourishing. And again, this is a vision. It's a beautiful vision. It's a vision that is quite frequently not lived up to. Christianity falls short of this all the time. Gets ensnared in power politics, gets ensnared in all these other things. But the vision is there for Christianity in particular, and all religions in general, to offer a lot to the common good, to offer a lot to politics and the world that we live in. And it's something that I think should be respected. So anyway, that's it. That's the last one. Thank you for your time and your listening. I hope these have been helpful. Feel free to reference these in any way you see fit. But if I can be of assistance to you, obviously let me know. Otherwise, like I said, I hope it was helpful because I've enjoyed having you this semester.